Hi, I'd like to welcome our viewers to another episode of Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified aerial or anomalous phenomena and close encounter experiences. The series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am the host, Kimberly Engels. I'm very excited about my guest today. I'm here with Dr. Brenda Denzler, who is an independent scholar and the author of The Lure of the Edge. So, Brenda, thank you so much for being here with me today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for asking.
Of course, of course. So, a little bit more about Brenda. Brenda is a mostly retired writer, editor, sometimes speaker. She recently spoke at the Archives of the Impossible conference. She's currently living in rural North Carolina. She received her Ph.D. in religious studies from Duke in 1998. She's the author of The Lure of the Edge, Scientific Passions, Religious Beliefs, and the Pursuit of UFOs, which came out on the University of California Press in 2001. She's also the author of invited chapters in scholarly books on religion and the UFO subculture, and some articles on UFOs and religion. Her current interest is in mining humanity's folkloric and religious traditions to better understand the provenance and nature of the gods, the gentry, elementals, djinn, angels, demons, and similar entities in terms that treat them as something other than fictions, with no more substance than mirrors into which we look to regulate, console, or understand ourselves as human beings. When she is not writing, she reads voraciously, enjoys her grandkids, and grabs most of her opportunities to spend time with friends. She's at home on her 4 acres, where she is a mom to 2 dogs and 2 large and energetic young pups and a geriatric cat. So, Brenda, very excited about the conversation today, especially with your current research interests and some of the recent things that you've brought to the conversation. I was really, intrigued by your talk that you gave at Rice, and I hope we can dive a little bit more into that.
Sure.
Before we jump into the questions, I like to give viewers who are joining us for the first time just a little bit more understanding of phenomenology and what it is. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that was founded by Edmund Husserl, and it's rooted in a rigorous examination of first-person consciousness and experience. Husserl himself advocated for a method of bracketing or parenthesizing, which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of exactly what is being interacted with and describe very carefully what appears. So the phenomenological analysis involves describing exactly what appeared to the individual and how what appears is received, organized, and classified or formed judgments about by the individual conscious subject. While the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed, what they felt, how they formed judgments about it, and how they integrated this into their experience of self, other, and world. So with that background in mind, let's shift to talking a little bit about your work. So you gave a really interesting keynote address recently at the Rice University Archives of the Impossible 2025 conference in April. A really engaging talk. And, you present in this talk this idea of kind of a, multidimensional or 5D theory to ground, or just basically a 5D theory of the UFO or UAP phenomenon. And so I would like, if you're willing, to just tell the viewers a little bit more about this hypothesis or this theory that you put out there, and why you think that this is a more likely explanation for UFO experiences and encounters than the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Well, I am more comfortable calling this a hypothesis. It doesn't come up to the level of a theory at this
Okay,
point, but I do tend to use the terms interchangeably. So
sure.
think hypothesis when I say theory.
Absolutely.
I actually came up with this idea because I was trying to reconcile the nuts and bolts aspects of UFO events. You know, the fact that they do leave physical traces. There are alleged crash retrievals and alleged non-human bodies. Uh, the father-in-law of one of my friends on his deathbed confessed that when he was in the military, he was taken to see a living non-human entity that was in military custody. And I don't know how to disbelieve that. I don't know how to say he's crazy, he was lying. So I have to accept that as provisional, you know, let's, what if it's true? So I
Yeah.
was trying to reconcile all of that with the high weirdness aspects of UFO encounters, not just during the encounter, but events leading up to and especially in the aftermath of having UFO encounter. For a very long time, it has been pointed out that there are a lot of paranormal aspects to UFO events. And Jacques Vallée, John Keel, uh, people like this have presented this idea. And it's the one that has always made a great deal of sense to me and seemed to me to account for most of the phenomena, at least the phenomena that I could truly believe happened. Uh, but in this day and age, at this point in time, there are more physical phenomena. And so I had to come at how do I reconcile the physicalness and the paranormalness? And th th what I came up with was an idea that is basically a riff on Michael Masters' work. He's a biological anthropologist and thinks that the non-human entities, the NHIs, might be our far distant progeny who've come back to visit the old folks. That's us, that they're time travelers. So I was riffing on his idea and saying, what if it's not our far distant progeny? But he makes a good point that these entities are invariably, they have a human body shape
Mhm.
and they seem to be able to breathe our air and they know our languages. They can communicate with us. So I thought, what if physicists, a lot of them are saying that consciousness is the fundamental thing in the universe, and that consciousness is prior to the brain, that the brain in humans does not create consciousness. Consciousness is prior to the brain. The brain acts like a radio receiver. So
Fever.
if consciousness is central, then what if the forces of evolution worked in all available dimensions? And physicists say that there are very likely more than just the three, or if you count time, the four dimensions that we're aware of that we operate within. So, what if evolution worked in other dimensions that we do not typically find it easy to access? And because the environment, the Earth environment, is a similar environment, naturally the entities that evolved into those other dimensional contexts were shaped by that environment just like human beings were in evolution, which might account for the similarity yet difference. So that's how I came up with the idea. And I had to rethink the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And the problem, I just, it may be correct. If it's correct, I think it's probably only partially correct. But it does, the ETH does not account for all the weirdness associated with UFO events. Government and intelligence agencies in the United States have used the UFO subculture as kind of their sandbox where they've played around from almost the get-go. And they always invoke extraterrestrial as an idea. It's not an extraterrestrial craft.
Yeah.
And there's been so much government intelligence community manipulation of the UFO subculture and the ideas that circulate within it that I think their constant invocation of extraterrestrial means we ought to grab onto that idea very lightly and entertain some suspicion about it. In addition to that, the behavior of the entities that are associated with UFOs don't make logical sense from a human point of view, whether you consider them to be explorers or scientists from some other planet.
Mhm.
And so many UFOs events over the last 70 years, if why so many? If they were true off-worlders, you'd think that at some time in the last 70 years, they would have tried to establish more overt contact, and yet that hasn't happened. Folks who have lived here all along, however, might not need that. Entities who live in this Earth environment with us, but unseen by us because they live in a different dimension, might not feel the need to establish contact, or they may have established contact very long ago. In the early days, entities would tell contactees that they were from local stars, in other words, that they were ETs, but subsequent scientific discoveries have made it abundantly clear that this is not the case. It can't be, at least not to create entities like we are. And the entities seem to be able to breathe our air and function in our gravity, which would indicate that maybe they're really local guys. They're neighborhood boys. They're not off-worlders. So all of that, I just don't think the extraterrestrial hypothesis works. I think that an interdimensional hypothesis takes better account of more of the data, both instrumented and personal.
Yeah, this is when it becomes really interesting to me as a phenomenologist, because if you don't take the accounts of people interacting with entities seriously, and as we both know, there's some people in the field who don't, and you just stay at the level of only looking at, the physical data, or the what the craft do, or what the objects, how they move, then you can kind of stay in that realm of the extraterrestrial hypothesis and say this seems like the most likely explanation would be something coming from another planet.
Mhm.
But I'm like you, that I think that that crumbles pretty quickly when we actually look at the reports of people who are interacting with the alleged occupants, right?
Well,
What the
that's what got
beings,
me. Yeah,
yeah,
that's what got me into this to start with. Was Whitley Strieber's book was like they talk about gateway drugs. That
okay,
was the gateway drug.
that was the gateway for you.
Communion, communion was the gateway. And then we moved to Bud Hopkins with Intruders, David Jacobs with Secret Life, and then Philip Klass, the arch skeptic, the arch debunker, came to give a talk in my hometown. And so I went to see him because I thought, Philip Klass, he's going to make sense of all this.
All this.
It's all going to fall into place. And what fell into place was the idea that Philip Klass was full of it. He did not, it was extraordinarily bad job of trying to explain events. And so I really was thrown back to the personal experiences, the phenomenology, although I didn't know that term at that time to call it that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and phenomenology is just one method for
Mhm.
studying the personal experiences or the lived experiences. But I think that, of course, just looking at the individual experiences only, that doesn't necessarily get us to a firm conclusion about who they are or where they're coming from.
Mhm.
But when you have people throwing out explanations that are so in in contrast to what people are reporting in
Right.
the appearances, that's when it becomes a problem for me, because any explanatory hypothesis, and we'll stick with that term, any
Right.
explanatory hypothesis that we put out should be able to account for a large amount of this phenomenological data.
Exactly.
And first of all, null hypotheses that these are just, again, like human technology, that doesn't do it for me for a lot of
Right.
reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But the ETH also falls considerably short. I think the only way you can defend the ETH is if you ignore a large amount of the data. I mean, just going back to Whitley Strieber, he's mentioned so many times that like apparitions of the dead show up in these experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even on that original night. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and all kinds of weird things. And entities, like you said, who communicate with
Right.
us in our
Right.
languages. Sometimes they look just like us or very similar
Yep.
to us. They're
Right.
just like maybe have pointy ears or something like that. And then, the information that they give is not always accurate. They say, oh yeah, I came from this star system, or I came from Mars, and we know that now to not be true. So I mean, all of these things together, it just, to me, it doesn't add up to the ETH. So I think something like what you've put out, and it's kind of similar to what philosopher James Madden has put out too, with
Yes.
his Uber
Yes.
Welt terrestrial hypothesis, that they're
Mm-hmm.
just exist kind of, they're here on Earth with us, but they
Right.
are evolved at a spectrum of reality that's outside of our sensory capacities.
And also, I would say Mac Tani's with his book, his little thin book called The Cryptoterrestrials.
Oh, sure.
And they're, on very similar wavelengths. So
Okay.
yeah,
I
yeah,
haven't actually read, I've heard of that one. I haven't read it yet,
very
so I'll
good.
have to check it
Very
out.
good. And
Absolutely.
thin. You can do it in a couple of hours.
Couple of okay, okay, awesome. I like those kind of books.
Yes.
So I think I had a question about how you make use of experience or testimony, but you've already answered that to an extent. I mean, I
Right.
think that it's very clear that your hypothesis is based in a large extent on what
Mhm.
people who encounter the UAP or their occupants
Mm-hmm.
report as occurring.
Right.
So let's move to this idea of, well, at one point in your talk, you talked about this reaction of awe
Mm-hmm.
that many UFO or UAP experiencers, that it's very common in the phenomenology, or at least,
Right.
so first of all, maybe explain a little bit about that reaction of awe, um, but also why you think that your hypothesis can account, or how does your hypothesis account for that common, response that people have to a UFO or a UAP sighting.
Well, when I look at close encounter reports, I, it has been pointed out by others who came before me that there are a lot of patterns and parallels with other kinds of entity reports down through human history. And religious studies is my field. And at this point in my life, I am no longer willing to privilege any particular religious tradition. I think that it is possible that encounters with these entities throughout human history may have led to some of our religious traditions. That includes Christianity. I'm not holding it out as the exception to the rule. In thinking about why this uh, might, should have happened, why would humans have reacted in this way? That I had what Diana Pasulka calls a book experience, a book event.
Sure.
Except nowadays, it's more like a screen on the computer event, but it's kind of the same thing. I was reminded of a book that I had earlier read about why God won't go away.
Hmm.
And so I was looking back into that. They talk about how there is a piece of an area in the human brain that's a part of the very basic piece of the human brain that gets triggered uh, by that when it is triggered, it tends to produce feelings of awe in the person. So anything that will trigger that, uh, their reaction would be one of awe and amazement. And if whatever it is that triggered it was sufficiently above and beyond what we could otherwise conceptualize or do, perhaps worship, subservience, fear, a feeling of potential danger. This even happened when the object that came through the solar system in 2017, they called it Oumuamua, which I think translates into messenger from afar. When the scientists were talking about what this object might be and how it was not matching up its movements and were not matching up with known celestial objects, the theory was floated, the hypothesis was floated that it could be indeed a messenger from some other civilization that just, happened to be passing through.
Hmm.
Not the civilization, the messenger,
The
the
messenger, sure.
object. And the reactions, even of scientists, even of astronomers and physicists whose world is the world of science, they were reacting with awe, and they were talking in religious terms. So it's not a reaction. This reaction of awe is not something that, the poor ignorant people have because, they need gods. They need somebody to rule over them. And so they respond with awe because they're simple-minded. That's not the case at all. It's a fundamental human trait to respond to certain kinds of triggers with awe. And I suspect that this has helped to shape the nature of our relationship with these non-human intelligences that live in our environment with us through the years. It's I think it's a fundamental, for me, it's a hypothesis about why the reactions, the interactions that we have had with this non-human intelligence have behaved this way throughout human history.
So what specifically, what types of experiences trigger that reaction, or what do you think it is about these particular entities, or this, or the UFOs, the UAP, that trigger that response?
I think unexpected is
Okay.
a part of it, the issue of surprise, the issue of whatever it is that you're viewing seeming to be above and beyond what is normal and typical in your human society context. And of course, now we really are a global society now, so that context is very, very big.
Yeah.
And when something occurs that is beyond that context, it kind of sends you a bit of a shock, a bit of a surprise, and it makes you feel a little humbled, a little less than, a little, and if a relationship with this thing evolves and develops, uh, it's easy to see how awe could turn into subservience, in uh, either a positive or a negative sense.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I want to shift to, well, I mean, it's not really a shift, just a pivot. Um, you brought up, in your bio, your current research interests. You're looking into things like, gentry, elementals. I know you're reading about the djinn. These different folkloric religious entities that people have interacted with in different cultural contexts over the centuries. What similarities, could you say anything specific, about any of these that you'd like to elaborate on? What specific similarities do you see between these manifestations of these folkloric beings and the UFO entities?
Well, others have, like Keith Thompson and Patrick Harper, have written along these lines regarding the fairy folk and angels. One of the non-human types that I found interesting, and especially because of its religious being embedded in a religious tradition, is the idea of the jinn. And the more that I have read about Muslim ideas about who and what the jinn are, the more I think, oh yeah, yeah. They they are uh they're shapeshifters. They're tricksters, which means that you take what they tell you provisionally, because their standards for truth telling are not necessarily the same as ours. Um, they appear and disappear at will in just a moment. They can make themselves visible to Eric Davis talks about having been at a big outdoor event in, I think it was either Arizona or Southern California, with a group of people that he had been working with. And this was a bring your wives and families kind of event. They were all outside, patio, pool, uh, and Eric and his wife saw this giant UFO appear over the group. Nobody else in the
Nobody else
group
saw
saw
it.
it, but he and his wife did. See, that's a classic Jin move, to be able to limit
Who
who
can see?
can see you. Um, these these traits, uh, I'm especially taken with the idea of the jinn simply because in the Muslim tradition, the dominant idea seems to be that they are not morally bad or morally good as a species, that they are just like humans. Some people are bad, some people are good. It's various. Um, the idea of sexual um interaction between humans and jinn is is talked about in the Muslim literature. And it makes sense in the context of what UFO experiencers talk about in relation to being, you know, the source donors for eggs and sperm to create hybrid children. It's a similar kind of thing. It's just the process has been apparently technologized. I mean, there are cases where it's actual sexual union between the aliens, the entities, and the human, but very often it's medicalized, which, fits a technological culture. And that is something else that Islam says about the jinn is they can present themselves to you in a way that will make sense to you.
Hmm.
And so I think the jinn is an area of pattern recognition, pattern overlap that has not been very much explored in the UFO subculture. Angels have been explored, the fairy folk have been explored, but the jinn haven't. And I think it's fertile ground for more study.
It sounds extremely similar. I mean, everything that you were saying, I was like, yes, that sounds like the UFO entities. That sounds
Exactly.
like the UFO entities. That's what
Exactly.
like them. And
Uh-huh.
I think that the point that you were making that, these are interactions with some kind of entity, whether they've been called fairies or they've been called angels, or as you said, they've been called jinn, or the various ways that people have referred to them had been happening for centuries. But it seems also that our relationship with them has evolved at the same time that our technologies have evolved. Because it's like even in the earlier UFO sightings, it seems like the technology that they would be displaying was always just a few generations ahead of ours. And then as our technologies got better, then their technologies also got better too, right? And again, that doesn't fit the extraterrestrial hypothesis. If they were extraterrestrials who came from way over there, they would be using essentially the same technology in 1940 that they're using in 2020. It would
1970.
not
Yeah.
have had like subtle changes in technology that they're using. So, or I mean, or it may not even be the technology they're actually using. It may just be the way that it appears to us, right? As you said, they may be capable of presenting themselves in a way that makes them seem just a few generations more advanced than us.
And it makes them understandable to us.
Right.
Or
It
at
makes
least
them
more understandable.
comprehensible. Exactly. Exactly. We can see that, oh, this is a civilization that's somewhat similar to us, but they have, these advanced tools that we don't have.
There are a number of people who say that the reason this happens is because they are actually, if you'll pardon the pun, taking a page from science fiction. That ideas that our science fiction writers come up with help to seed ideas into these entities that they then
Mirror back.
display to us, they use in their interactions with us. So that is, one possibility for why that occurs.
I mean, and that's really interesting because, in the 40s when there was uh, the flood of UFO sightings that emerged in the 40s, 1940s and 50s, we were also becoming at that time culturally interested in going to space. We had the space race going on and we were confronting the idea for the first time that we might be able to travel off planet. And so, that's kind of where our scientific or science fiction imagination was at that particular moment. And it's almost like the experiences reflected that back to us, right? Like, because that's when they were saying, "Oh yeah, we're just from this neighboring star system right over here," and they would, were appearing as space people, whereas at other times they've appeared and interacted and presented to us in different ways. I'm really interested also in the trickster or the deceptive elements that they display. Yeah, as you said, the djinn, I've been known to have a loose relationship with the truth, but John Keel and Jacques Vallée have really pointed this out, and I think it's important because, or I mean, I just think it's something we have to talk about, that they don't always, these beings do not always tell the truth, right? And it's pretty consistent that they'll give people dates and they'll say these things are going to happen on this date and then it doesn't, or that they'll say, oh, we're from this neighboring star system and they're not. Or they'll just, Vallée talked about how sometimes the things that they would say would just be absurd. The Eagle River, Wisconsin incident where he asks, they land in his yard and he goes out and they say, "Can you fill up this jug of
His
water
large
for
jug,
us?"
and in exchange they give him some buckwheat pancakes
They
that are
give
on
him some
cardboard.
pancakes in exchange, and nothing about it makes any sense.
Exactly.
And so, if they are evolving here alongside us, how does that fit in? Why are they tricksters? Why don't they interact with us, more straightforwardly?
I don't know. Uh, Being a trickster seems to be who they are. It's like asking a malignant narcissist with lots and lots of power to be something that
If they're not.
they are actually not. They can't do it. They just can't. It's not in them. So the
Fair
trickster
enough.
are a trickster is kind of, it's their nature. It is who and what they are. It's not to say that they can never be trusted.
Sure.
It's not to say that they're demonic and evil,
Right.
but
I
their relation, sometimes I would imagine, I'm guessing, that they're playing loose and fast with what we would consider the truth, may be for a reason, not just to be, contrary,
right.
but because they're trying to make a point to us, and just telling us plain straight out may not be as effective, they, at least in their thought, that as giving us a lesson, letting us, learn and figure this out. And tricksterish behavior is their teaching method. It could be.
Yeah, if you look at the trickster archetype in like different cultures, just let's look at maybe like Native American cultures and like, coyote. That was the point, or the indigenous clowns. That was exactly it. There was a message there. Like they
Right,
would act in deceptive ways,
right,
but it was a teaching tool, right? It was shaking us out of, it was trying to get us to look at something, right?
right, right.
Often, the indigenous clowns were trickster figures, but they would intentionally transgress rules and
Yeah.
kind of create disorder
Hmm.
to remind us of the importance of order, and to look around at what ways am I causing disorder in my
Hmm.
own life or something like that. It was like, or trying to like blur some of the boundaries to bring our attention to those boundaries,
Hmm.
right? Or to subvert something about
Right.
the current social order.
Hmm.
So yeah, and yeah, and many different cultures have had trickster figures, and there's
Hmm.
often that kind of element. It's not just tricking you just to be mean or to,
Hmm.
be evil, like you said. It's tricking or it's putting something out there because there's something that you're supposed to figure out and learn from it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's something that I think I advocate. I have said that I think that the human race has grown up a little bit, and we need to have a different kind of relationship with these entities than the ones that we've had in the past. Uh, but the fact that they do seem to be tricksters is going to complicate trying to have a relationship that both species um, can deal with. But I think it's important that we do. I think it's the next step. I don't know if humanity is ready to take it. Have no idea how these entities feel about, us taking a step like that. But it's what I think needs to happen. We need a more mature relationship with they're intelligent entities that share the earth with us. We need to know them better.
So I think that's a great pivot into my next question. And I'm in agreement with you. I feel like we're at a point in human history where we're ready to acknowledge this and do this. So many experiencers, not all, but at least some, they emerge from these experiences very different than prior to when they had them, right?
Right.
I spoke about this a little bit in my talk. They may have changed metaphysical understandings about who they are and about who the world is and about how they relate to others. They also often have changed ethical values, right? They have more deeper respect for Earth, for other forms of life, changed relationships, an increased sense of, spirituality, altruism. Um, so why do you think, in your hypothesis again, why do you think that sometimes, at least sometimes, again, it's not 100%, but at least sometimes that's the result of our interaction with these beings?
I really don't have a good sense for that. I know that the things that you mentioned just now, I have no problem with. If that is the end result, and maybe it's has to do with our brain. Maybe there's something about that God point in our brain that reacts with awe when it's triggered. Maybe there's something about that reaction and that triggering that creates a cascade of feelings, thoughts, ideas that eventuate many times in those kinds of changes. It may have nothing to do with the entities per se, but simply with the experience of having contacted anything like these entities. Or it may indeed have something to do with them. It may be something they're trying to teach or convey. The one thing, and I've got no problems with that. That's great. That's lovely. But what I do have trouble with is the fact that the interactions between humans and these entities continue to be non-consensual. I mean, they've been interacting with us even in our, more modern times, not to count all through human history, but even just in modern times, they've been interacting with us enough that they must surely understand that we don't like this,
Mhm.
and that some kind of mutuality and consent is necessary for humans. And when I see experiencers dropping that piece of the interaction experience and making I don't want to say light of it, that's not right. Making it seem like it's really not that big a deal anymore. It that doesn't sit well with me. I think no, that's not the kind of relationship we want to have with these entities. But maybe that's a signal that they don't want on the entity's part. Maybe they don't want a more egalitarian, more, peer type relationship with us. Maybe that's why they continue to do that. And uh kind of, love bomb the experiencers until they finally are kind of like, well, okay, this is fine. I don't know. I part of me wants to say this is wonderful, this is great, but a part of me is very cautious about it. I'm not sure that it's altogether, it's not okay. To take us against our will is not okay. But if they're going to take us with our consent, is that going to require them to engage with us in a more open fashion? And they don't want to do that? I don't know.
Yeah, so the non-consensual aspects are actually really interesting to me because I'm a phenomenologist, I'm also an ethicist. And so, you know, the when we do things non-consensually, even let's look at it through the lens of just human ethics. Um, sometimes I do non-consensual things to my cat.
Right.
I trap her in a carrier and I take her to
Uh-huh.
the vet. And she gets
Uh-huh.
traumatized while she's there. She gets poked
Uh-huh.
and she has no idea why.
Right.
And but I still think that that is morally okay because I know something that she doesn't, that this is actually for her benefit. And there's no way for me to communicate to her why I'm doing this.
Mhm.
Now, I don't think the parallel completely works with the
Right.
NHI because it seems they are capable of communicating to us why they would be doing this, if it really truly is for our own benefit and our own good. But my own hypothesis is that there can be another reason to withhold the information if telling us outright may compromise some aspect of the result of the intended benefit.
True.
So again, it's just a tentative hypothesis that I have when thinking about this, because the non-consensual and the traumatic elements are there, and I'm not someone who just ignores them. I'm not someone who says, oh, it's just okay.
Yeah.
I think that we need to address it head on. But when thinking about the possibilities of why that occurs, because there are, experiencers who have non-consensual contact and still emerge from it with a really, and I don't, it seems to me more deep and profound than love bombing or what they call it, Stockholm syndrome or something like
Yeah.
that. When you speak to, I've interviewed quite a few of them, and they don't like to be positioned as victims, and they don't like
I
to
know.
be,
Yes.
say, oh, you just they fooled you into thinking that this was okay. They actually see the non-consensual elements as serving some kind of role in the process, that
Right.
and so perhaps, there's a benefit there that just being upfront and saying we're going to do this to you and getting their consent would compromise
Mhm.
that result that they're trying to produce.
Right.
Um, just a possibility that I'm working on in my own
Yeah.
research and my own thinking about this.
Okay.
But I appreciate you, emphasizing it because I agree with you that these experiences are not all love and light. Like there's,
Yeah.
like you said,
Right.
there's non-consent that happens, and there's people that have been traumatized by them, and
Yeah.
we need to deal with that head on and not
Right.
pretend that it isn't there.
Well,
Um,
the traumatic aspect of encounters, I think, was a big part of the reason that I was drawn into this when I read Whitley Strieber's book, because I actually had an experience that was very similar. And for a while, I was having trouble trying to figure out what happened. But when I was 5 years old, I was very, very sick, and I was in the hospital. I was isolated. My parents weren't around, which, corresponds to experiencers who are taken from the time they're children, and their parents sit by and watch it happen. Of course, their parents are turned off, but as children, they don't
yeah,
quite
no.
understand. And I was taken to the hospital. I spent 6 weeks in isolation. And at one point, I had to have an abdominal paracentesis, meaning they had to poke a hole in my abdomen to drain out fluid because my liver and my kidneys were shutting down. And I was basically going to drown in my own body fluids, with overnight if they didn't do something. So there were people in white doctor's gowns, 3 people who were beside my bed at night. There was a light back and over my head, and they were talking about me. And then I was picked up out of my bed, which was, other than that one light in the room, it was dark. I was taken down a bright hallway, taken into a procedure room, turned with my left side down, and then I was physically restrained by the adults present so that I couldn't move while they did this paracentesis. And they kept asking me, does this hurt? Does this hurt? So that traumatized me. I didn't realize that for decades. Decades. I had signs and symptoms of having PTSD, but never made sense of it. I had repetitive nightmares. And so when I read Whitley Strieber's Communion, and then I read Bud Hopkins' Intruders and David Jacobs' Secret Life, and I'm reading all these stories that just hit those things over and over again. It really, really resonated with me. And I, to this day, the trauma emerged into full consciousness in 2009 when I got a cancer diagnosis. And since, which made going through cancer treatment really, really exciting, not in any good way. And to this day, I'm working on dealing with the trauma and managing my feelings and learning how to manage more appropriately. Uh, so for me, it's especially difficult to look at experiencers and who've had such similar experiences, which most of them seem to initially at least experience as traumatic. and say, well, it's okay. I look at my experience and, I say, yeah, but it saved my life. They tapped my stomach, they took the fluid off, my kidneys and liver kind of kicked back in again, and I'm alive. It doesn't really matter that they traumatized me because a good thing came in the end.
Because
And
there was
I've
a
had,
benefit. They were doing it for
it
a
was,
reason.
they were doing it for a reason. They weren't just being mean. And I can tell myself that, but it's not how it feels.
Sure.
I have a battle between what I intellectually understand and what those feelings
What the
are.
feelings were. Sure.
And so I lay my experience over the experience of people who've had contact with these NHIs. And I marvel at the fact that they seem to be able to come to a place where they're not traumatized by contact anymore. I'm not there. I'm better than I used to be, but I'm not there with my experience. So what they manage to do and why and how they do that is a real amazing thing for me.
I agree. It's pretty amazing to me too, and it makes it, and that's the part I think actually in this whole phenomenon that interests me the most is going through something of that level of trauma and having the additional ontological shock of this being non-human
Right.
beings that you've been told
Exactly.
cannot exist and do not exist, and somehow emerging from the other side, saying that I wouldn't give it up. I would do it again, right? And many of them do say that, in the free study, they found about 80%, and so that is really, that's what actually the thing that drew me in so much was that particular piece. Like, I don't think I would have gotten as interested in this as I have if that part wasn't there, because it was, I really wanted to try to understand how and why those transformations occur. And I still don't 100% have an answer. I have hypotheses, right? I just think that this is a type of transformative experience that we have yet to dig into in a really robust and deep way to figure out the exact mechanism of what's happening, because it's been dismissed as not real for so long. It's just been
Yeah.
ignored. Um, I actually really like that you brought up this experience, because it also, it speaks to something that, excuse me, we have to be careful of when we're doing phenomenology, right? Which is that there can be more than one source or origin for a similar type of experience, because you were
Right.
reading Whitley Strieber and his account of being taken by non-human beings and, having these non-consensual procedures that were done to him and the needles that were going in, and that reminded you, and as a lot of people, right? A lot of people read Whitley's book and said, "Holy shit, this is something that I remember," right?
Yes.
And in your case, it did have a traditional explanation.
Explanation.
Like, we didn't have to dig up an abduction event for that. And
And
I
and
know
by
that
the
there,
way, I've gone up and I've gone back and gotten my hospital records. So it's not a matter of, oh, I'm just imagining that that's the reason and I really was abducted. No, that's not what happened. I've got
you
medical
got the
records that
records.
validate.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and so I think it just speaks to a level of caution that we have to have when doing phenomenology. And I know that you were a little hesitant even, to make this comparison, because you didn't want other people's close encounters dismissed on these grounds. And
right.
and
Correct.
I'm completely on board with that. But I do think that, it points out that when we're doing a phenomenological analysis, we have to be open to more than one. We can't, the benefit of the phenomenological analysis is drawing out the experience while not making, at least in the first analysis, a judgment about what that source is. And if there are conventional explanations for the phenomenology, I'm still of the opinion that those should be the first explanation in terms of the
Right.
source, right?
Right.
Now, I think it is very much the case that many times, in terms of what experienced, both in terms of the phenomenon itself, or the phenomenology of the experience itself, but also when you look into the individual's history, there isn't a conventional explanation, and John Mack did that in his own work. He looked for conventional explanations, things that could rule
Yeah.
this out, if they had trauma in their childhood that was similar to what they were describing. That could have been a
But,
basis for not
but
being.
I will say though that if you had asked me before 2009 whether I had anything particularly traumatic happen in my childhood, I would have told you no.
But no.
And I could have told you all about that hospitalization experience in 50 words or less and with absolute dispassion, not one emotion whatsoever. So there's always the possibility that there's something there that even the experiencer is not aware
Not
of
aware of, sure,
at that
sure.
time.
At that particular moment.
But I still, what you said, yes, my experience is probably relatively rare among the whole field of people who've had this type of experience because eventually it did out that it was a medical treatment trauma, and most experiencer, the vast majority of experiencers do not have that kind of experience.
Right.
And I would hate to have their experience, their reality dismissed just because mine was similar.
Agreed.
But from a phenomenological point of view, how do you make that distinction? At first, the first data collection in phenomenology is to just collect the data.
Collect the
Don't
data.
make
Yeah.
judgments about it, just collect it. But at some point, how do you make those distinctions and judgments? Would you have been able to separate out my story from other experiencer stories and say, this is different. It's not quite like the others. You know, um, before I realized how would you have just, how does
Well, I mean,
phenomenology help us?
I think, to be honest, your experience never involved a UFO. You,
Correct?
it never involved like you being floated through a wall or a window.
Correct?
Right. And
Mhm.
then the beings that you remembered poking you, remembered
Human.
them as pretty human, right?
Yeah,
So, you weren't coming into contact with beings with,
right.
big black eyes, and then you
Correct.
weren't having, ongoing weird electrical functionings in your home in
Correct.
the aftermath, or, weird psychic phenomena and telepathic abilities that were developing, which a lot, in the aftermath, many of them report. So, I mean, I think that even though there might be similarities that we would see in your experience in terms of the very physical nature of
Uh-huh.
this contact, I do think also the experiencer reports that don't have a traditional explanation would have elements in them that your account does not. And I mean,
Yeah,
that's what we're part of what we're trying to do in the metadata study is, first of all, we're collecting the data, and then we want to see, which of them it seems like this could actually just be a traditional, as you said, a medical trauma. If that's
mhm,
the most, the Occam's razor, if that's the simple
right.
explanation, then there's no reason to jump to the idea that this was a non-human encounter if it can be explained as a medical trauma.
I
Uh,
like that. I like that. That
yeah.
makes good sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. That helps. I mean, and I do think it's very possible that some people who think they've had a close encounter, it may actually be, as you said, some kind of medical trauma. But I also am in agreement with you that I think that in terms of the entire data set, it's probably a small
Very,
group
very
that would be
tiny.
explainable through a traditional medical trauma.
Mm.
But it's a good point because it is something that we have to be mindful of and cautious of in these analyses, is that we have to keep that, I'll just bring up that Occam's razor again. If a traditional explanation for any account, whether it's an abduction account or it's just a UFO, if a traditional explanation actually does fit, then you don't need to jump to something that's anomalous or something that, bringing in the NHI as the most likely solution because or the most likely explanation for that experience.
I like the idea that phenomenology is a tool that enables such a fine distinction, a close distinction. Uh, that's as you know, I'm just learning about
Sure.
phenomenology, and I like the fact that it is able to make those kinds of distinctions. It's a good tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's important that we do. And I think there would be very, important distinctions between a medical trauma event and someone experiencing an abduction and, you know, using phenomenology to pinpoint what those differences would be,
Mhm,
I think would be I think is very useful.
mhm.
Um, a, a good methodology to bring some rigor and just some careful analysis in terms
Right.
of how we examine experience or testimony.
Yep, I like it.
Awesome. So Brenda, that's all of the questions that I had. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss or put on the table?
I'm sure I'll think of it in about an hour. At the moment, no, I'm good.
Okay. Well, I've really enjoyed this interview. It was a lot of fun, and we covered a lot of ground. And I think we went to some really exciting places. So I want to just thank you for your continued work and your contributions in the field. You've been at this a lot longer than I have, and so I appreciate your initial book, The Lure of the Edge, and then what you're bringing to the table in the conversation with your more recent contributions. So please keep that up. I think
Thank you.
we need more voices like yours in this conversation. And I would like to thank our viewers for joining us for another episode of A Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. I am your host, Kimberly Engels. The series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies. And once again, thank you to our guest, Dr. Brenda Denzler. And please join us again for another interesting discussion of a phenomenology of the phenomenon.
Thanks. Bye bye.